Late evening she cloaked the streets in a thick veil of darkness. The weak light from the street lamps barely pierced the gloom, illuminating only small patches of the road. The city seemed deserted, no sounds, no movement. But this silence was deceptive. It felt as if the darkness itself concealed something unsettling. A light breeze swept leaves from the trees, swirling them down onto the sidewalk. Amidst this silent tableau appeared a girl, walking briskly down the empty street, desperately glancing over her shoulder. Her breath came in gasps, though she tried not to reveal her fear. The atmosphere around her made her heart race, and every rustle seemed like a threat. She wasn't sure if someone was following her or if it was just her imagination, but every time she caught the faint sound of footsteps behind her, fear washed over her in waves. The light from the street lamps did little to help. It only heightened the contrast between the illuminated areas and the dark alleys that were impossible to peer into. Suddenly, her pace quickened. It seemed as though her pursuer was getting closer, the footsteps growing clearer. She broke into a run. Her sneakers thudded against the asphalt, the surrounding silence amplifying every movement. Panting, she stole a glance at the street ahead. Her car was just a few dozen meters away, a bright glimmer of hope in the sinister void. She ran with all her might, feeling the adrenaline surge through her body. She had only a little way to go when a distinct rustle came from behind as if someone was closing in. Without looking back, the girl quickened her pace, desperately hoping to reach her car before the unseen danger caught up with her. Each step felt interminably long, and the shadow following her seemed to stretch time itself. Eventually, she reached her car and, with trembling hands, snatched the keys from her pocket. Barely managing to open the door, she jumped inside, slamming it shut with a deafening bang. Inside, it was dark, with only the light from the street lamps barely filtering through the windows. She pressed the lock button, and her heart finally began to slow its frantic rhythm. Seconds dragged by, and it seemed she was safe, but the feeling of unease lingered. The girl tried to look around, but she could see nothing. Her fingers still trembled, and her body refused to calm down. Suddenly, something flickered outside, perhaps just a silhouette or a play of shadows, but her breath hitched again. Fear seized her once more. She pressed herself against the seat, trying not to move, even though her mind screamed to start the car and drive as far away as possible. Yet something held her back as if an instinct warned her that moving was dangerous. Time crawled by, tension mounting. Finally, after a few minutes, she decided to take the risk. Shaking, the girl reached for the ignition key. But just as she turned it, something knocked against the window. At that moment, her scream echoed down the empty street, but no one heard it. The light inside the car flickered out. The engine wouldn't start, and a suffocating silence descended. No one saw how it happened, but within moments, the car was empty. No signs of struggle, no sounds, no movement. She had vanished as if she had dissolved into thin air. The next morning, the neighborhood was engulfed in confusion. News of the girl's disappearance spread rapidly, filling the headlines of local newspapers and the screens of news channels. People discussed her absence, trying to find answers to questions that seemed to have no clear explanation. Residents, who usually felt safe in this quiet corner of the city, began closing windows and locking doors with every possible latch. The police searched for the girl, but leads were scarce. The car was found in the same spot where she had left it. The doors were locked, and there was nothing unusual inside, no signs of struggle, no fingerprints that could shed light on what had happened. The surveillance cameras installed along the street recorded nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished, leaving not a trace of her presence. This mysterious story gave rise to numerous rumors. Some claimed she had been kidnapped, others that she had run away, but most agreed on one thing: something strange was happening in this neighborhood. The day began as usual, gray and mundane. Catherine walked slowly down the sidewalk, her gaze fixed on the massive building she was about to enter. The walls, made of peeling bricks and stained with time and dust, seemed imbued with the spirit of the past. This old, seemingly abandoned building stood among workshops and warehouses, giving the entire area a somewhat grim and dreary appearance. The sense that time had frozen in this corner of the city was palpable, as if everything here had long lost its significance and continued to exist out of inertia. Catherine had taken this temporary job to get by until she found something more stable and suitable for herself. She didn't particularly like the place, but it paid her rent for her small apartment. So she ignored such trivialities. The surroundings had a depressing effect on her. Everywhere were buildings that hadn't seen repair in years, dirty windows of workshops overflowing with trash, and warehouse gates coated in rust. Even the air here felt different, heavy and filled with a strange mix of dust and oil. Approaching the door, she took a deep breath and pushed it open, hearing the familiar creak. Inside the office was just as gloomy as outside. Only a few flickering bulbs in the ceiling weakly illuminated the cracked walls and old furniture. Everything here seemed temporary, from the unstable desk to the yellowed papers piled on the shelves. Catherine tried to force herself to concentrate on her work tasks, but her thoughts kept wandering. Suddenly, her phone vibrated in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Glancing briefly at the screen, she saw it was her mom calling. With a smile on her face, she hit the answer button and held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Mom," her voice was slightly tired but warm. "Hi, dear, how are you?" her mother replied in a friendly tone. Catherine sat down at her desk, leaning back in her chair as she glanced out the window at the same dismal landscape. "Just the usual, at work, but I don't think it'll last long. It's a bit," she hesitated, choosing her words, "gloomy here." Her mother sighed on the other end. They often talked about Catherine's job, and her mother always worried about her safety. "Try not to stay too long. I'll be a bit late today too. I have some things to take care of. Maybe we'll see each other in the evening?" Catherine nodded, forgetting her mother couldn't see her. "Of course, don't rush, I'll figure something out." After a brief goodbye, the conversation ended. Catherine placed the phone back on the desk and pondered for a few seconds. The day was winding down, and her work required minimal effort. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the silent atmosphere still reigned, only occasionally interrupted by old trucks or cars belonging to nearby workshop workers. A strange feeling of loneliness washed over her every time she looked at those crumbling buildings. She wanted to escape from here as soon as possible. Deciding to distract herself, she threw on her jacket and headed for the door. Lunchtime had not yet arrived, but the thought of spending time in a local cafe seemed like a great idea. At least it would be a bit warmer, brighter, and smell fresh instead of dust and metal. Outside, the cool wind pleasantly cooled her heated thoughts. Catherine walked several blocks along her familiar route, trying to ignore the same gloomy architecture around her. The street leading to the cafe always felt a little deserted but cozy at the same time, especially with the arrival of autumn. Leaves rustled beneath her feet, and the sound of her footsteps was the only reminder that the city was still alive. The local cafe, small and old-fashioned, was located at the corner of the street. Through the window, one could always see a few patrons absorbed in their phones or books. She visited often, and this place always evoked a sense of warmth and calm that she lacked in her daily life. This time, the cafe was almost empty, which suited her just fine. The sound of the doorbell chimed softly as Catherine stepped back into the small cafe that had become something of a refuge from everyday grayness. Inside, it was warm and cozy, as always. The pleasant aroma of freshly baked pastries and coffee filled the air. A few patrons sat at tables, lost in their thoughts and conversations. Today was quiet, giving her the chance to relax a bit after a tiring day in the gloomy building surrounded by old warehouses. As she approached the counter to place her order, her gaze inadvertently fell on a man sitting at a table in the corner. He looked as if he didn't belong in this place. His clothes, a perfect suit, a spotless white shirt, and neatly styled hair, sharply contrasted with the general appearance of the area, where people looked more like workers or craftsmen covered in dust and grime. He seemed too clean and well-groomed for this abandoned corner of the city. Catherine couldn't take her eyes off him, feeling a slight suspicion rising within her. Her intuition seemed to warn her that something was off here. She often relied on her sense of caution, and it rarely let her down. The man sat calmly, sipping his coffee and flipping through a magazine, but his tense posture and too perfect appearance gave off an air of artificiality. "Your coffee," interrupted her thoughts the barista, placing a cup on the counter. She quickly turned away from the mysterious stranger and focused on her drink. Catherine grabbed her coffee and headed for a small table in the corner by the window. As she sipped her hot drink, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Out of the corner of her eye, she stole glances at him. He still sat there, flipping through the pages of the magazine, but now and then, she caught his gaze drifting in her direction. The moment their eyes met, a jolt of something unidentifiable shot through her. She tried to dismiss it, reminding herself to focus on her own life. Perhaps he was just another customer, a local businessman in need of a caffeine fix. She took another sip, trying to concentrate on the aroma of her coffee and the warmth of the mug in her hands. Minutes passed, and she began to relax a little. But then she noticed the man standing up and approaching her table. He moved confidently, his every step deliberate and precise. A twinge of anxiety gripped her as she wondered if she had misjudged the situation. He stopped right next to her, and for a moment, Catherine thought he might simply walk past. Instead, he smiled warmly and nodded. "Hi, I'm David," he introduced himself, extending a hand toward her. Catherine hesitated for a moment but then shook his hand, feeling a jolt of warmth and unease at the same time. "Catherine," she replied, unsure why she felt both drawn to him and wary. Something was intriguing about his presence, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. Catherine looked around the cafe, wondering if it was a good idea to let a stranger sit with her. But something about David's demeanor was disarming. Perhaps it was his charming smile or the genuine curiosity in his eyes. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded. "Sure, why not?" As they began to talk, Catherine found herself relaxing. David spoke eloquently about his work and interests, and the way he listened made her feel as though he genuinely cared about what she had to say. Time passed quickly, and soon they were laughing and exchanging stories. However, as their conversation deepened, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him before. Catherine couldn't shake the strange feeling that her chance encounter with David at the cafe was anything but random. Something about him had raised her suspicions from the very first moment, but she couldn't pinpoint what exactly. It was only after she left the cafe that her thoughts began to coalesce into a single narrative. David not only looked out of place in the neighborhood, but he also had been overly persistent in questioning her about her personal life. Her inner unease hadn't dissipated, it had only intensified with each passing hour. Catherine encountered him again the next day. It happened shortly after lunch when she decided to step out of the office for a breath of fresh air. As soon as she exited onto the street, the cool autumn breeze brushed against her face, and she took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. But as she walked a few steps along the old warehouse buildings, she noticed a familiar figure approaching her. David was impeccably dressed again, a neat blazer, polished shoes, and impeccably styled hair. Once more, he presented a stark contrast to the surrounding grayness. He approached her as if by coincidence, a smile on his face, but this meeting felt anything but coincidental to Catherine. "Hi, Catherine," he said as if they were old acquaintances, completely unfazed by her wary expression. "Hi," she replied, attempting to mask her anxiety. She didn't want to show her fear, although an unsettling fire of concern was already kindling inside her. David walked alongside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and without waiting for an invitation, he began to chat. At first, everything went much like the last time, neutral phrases, harmless questions, but his manner of speaking was just as insistent, keeping Catherine on high alert. "I recently started working at a warehouse nearby," he suddenly said, interrupting their mundane conversation. These words made her stop. A warehouse? She recalled how often she had seen that building from her office window. It was only a few blocks from where she worked, and it always struck her as dark, as if it concealed something dangerous. At that moment, something clicked inside her. Could their meetings not be coincidences? Really? Her voice came out forcedly indifferent. But inside she was boiling. Now her suspicions were taking on concrete form. "How long have you been working there?" "Just recently," he replied, casually running a hand through his hair. "I got out not too long ago. I had to find a job to start a normal life again." "Got out?" Catherine tried to keep her composure, but her heart raced. She realized he was talking about prison, but she didn't know how to ask about it directly without revealing her fear. David, noticing her reaction, smirked slightly, as if he had anticipated her fright. "Yeah, I recently got out of prison," he said, lowering his voice. "But that's all behind me now. I'm just trying to start fresh." Those words completely knocked her off balance. She felt a tightening in her chest from fear. Catherine stepped back, striving to maintain her external calm, but her thoughts were spiraling in different directions. Who was this person she had randomly bumped into? Why was he so interested in her? She fought to conceal her rising terror, but her face involuntarily tensed. David noticed this, raising an eyebrow as if relishing her reaction. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice lowering, which only heightened her fear. "I've left all that behind. I'm just trying to get back to a normal life. I work at the warehouse, earning a paycheck. Just like everyone else." Catherine nodded but didn't respond. She wanted nothing more than to leave, but something held her back. He continued speaking, seemingly enjoying the moment. She felt her anxiety growing with each of his words. Everything about him, his clothes, his job, his polished appearance, seemed like a facade hiding something dangerous. "What exactly happened?" she unexpectedly asked, trying to sound as confident as possible. Her voice was soft, but turmoil brewed inside her. David smiled as if he had been waiting for this question. "Nothing special. Just, one person misunderstood something, and I had to serve a couple of years. But that's in the past. I'm a different person now." These words provided her with no relief. She knew he was withholding something. Her intuition screamed at her to keep her distance. A desire to leave immediately flared up within her, to escape his gaze and sever all ties. However, she understood that doing so would appear suspicious. She didn't want to provoke him into something reckless. Catherine attempted to remain calm, but her legs trembled. She took a deep breath and forced a tight smile. "I understand. Well, good luck with your new life," she said, slowly backing away. "I have to go." David nodded, but something flickered in his eyes that made her heart race even faster. "Of course. If you need anything, you know where to find me." His voice sounded surprisingly friendly, but that friendliness now felt like a threat. Catherine turned and quickly headed back to the office, trying to put as much distance between herself and him as possible. When she was at a safe distance, she immediately pulled out her phone from her bag and, without stopping, began typing a message to her mother. Her fingers trembled, but she typed diligently, "Mom, please come pick me up. As soon as possible. I feel like something's off here." After sending the message, she put her phone back in her pocket and tried to calm herself. But the sense of escalating danger lingered. It felt as if it were tightly wrapping around her, making it hard to breathe. Catherine didn't know what to do next. But one thing was clear: staying in this neighborhood, especially near David, was dangerous. Catherine stood by the window of her office, gazing out at the street. The internal unrest hadn't left her since she learned about David's past. She kept checking her phone, waiting for a response from her mother, but no messages came. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest as if warning her of an impending threat. Her gaze slowly scanned the sidewalk below, and suddenly she noticed a familiar figure. David was standing across the street, directly opposite the building, his eyes fixed right on her car parked by the curb. She felt a cold fear seize her body, and her fingers instinctively clenched into a fist. "He's watching me," she thought. This wasn't just paranoia. There were too many coincidences and too many warning signs. Catherine tried to take a deep breath and calm down, but her breathing was shallow. David looked completely at ease, as if he were just admiring the street, but his focused gaze revealed more than any actions could. He wasn't rushing, making any unnecessary movements, but every gesture, every tilt of his head made her feel cornered. She momentarily stepped away from the window, trying not to draw attention to herself. "He can't know I've noticed him," she thought, cautiously peeking out again. But how could she leave without revealing her panic? David was too close, and Catherine realized that the slightest movement that betrayed her anxiety could lead to unwanted consequences. Her thoughts raced from one plan to another, but all of them felt too risky. Staying here was also impossible. David was waiting for something. Perhaps he wanted to ensure she was left alone? Or that she would step out unprepared? The fear of this man intensified with each passing second. Catherine began pacing around the office, checking the clock as if trying to buy herself some time. An idea crossed her mind: to stay at work until evening, hoping David would leave. But her gut feeling told her that wouldn't help. He seemed patient, and his interest in her was too persistent for him to just vanish. Picking up her phone, she wrote to her mother again, "Mom, where are you? I'm worried, there's a strange guy here." But still, there was no reply. Catherine felt her anxiety turning into panic. She quickly scanned the office. Everything seemed as familiar and safe as always, but today she felt how fragile that illusion was. There seemed to be people nearby, colleagues, doors, and walls meant to protect her. But as soon as she stepped outside, she could find herself face to face with David. She approached the window again and paused for a moment. David had changed position and was now right by her car. He leaned in, as if examining something, and that was too much. Her heart raced. This wasn't just random interest. He knew it was her car, and his focus on it was becoming intrusive. Without distraction, Catherine began contemplating how to leave the office discreetly. Maybe she could sneak out the back or call a taxi without approaching her car. But what if David saw her? He already knew what her car looked like, and if he noticed her trying to escape, it would only worsen the situation. With every second, her mind raced faster with various scenarios. Should she run or pretend everything was fine? Maybe just wait a bit to see if he would leave? But how long could she drag it out? Catherine glanced at David again. Now he was just standing next to her car, hands in his pockets, appearing in no hurry. She opened the office door and cautiously peeked into the corridor. It was quiet, as it always was at this hour. None of her colleagues would likely notice if she just left, saying she had errands to run. But something inside her warned that haste and panic were not the best choices. Catherine took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. She couldn't appear frightened. David seemed to sense fear, like a predator stalking its prey. Stay calm. Just walk out, get in your car, and drive away, she repeated to herself mentally. Don't show that you've noticed him. Let everything look like you're oblivious to anything strange. But inside, every fiber of her being resisted that decision. Every instinct screamed at her that leaving now was too dangerous. In the meantime, David stepped away from the car and walked down the street, not looking back. But that movement did not calm Catherine. Instead, it seemed even more unsettling. Maybe he was simply retreating to watch from a distance? Or to set a trap? Her thoughts spiraled even more, but she had no time to ponder. She walked to her desk, grabbed her bag, checked that her car keys were in place, and headed for the exit. With every step, she felt that David might suddenly reappear. Trying not to show her fear, she confidently stepped outside. As she approached her car, she looked around. David was nowhere in sight, but she knew he was nearby. His absence brought her brief relief, but that feeling quickly shifted to anxiety. Where could he have disappeared so quickly? Catherine opened the car door, trying to act as naturally as possible. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept herself in check. Just don't panic, she repeated to herself. As she started the engine, she glanced nervously in the mirrors. No one was there. She drove out of the parking lot, trying to remain calm. But her internal tension didn't dissipate. Even behind the wheel, she felt an unseen presence watching her. Every turn in the road seemed perilous, every shadow a potential threat. Catherine knew one thing: David hadn't left her alone. And no matter how far she drove, the feeling that he was watching her would linger. Catherine returned home, but the sense of safety she usually felt in her cozy apartment was nowhere to be found today. Every corner seemed suspicious, and every rustle outside sent shivers down her spine. She went through her routine, shedding her coat, making a cup of tea, and turning on the television in hopes of distracting herself. Instead, her attention was seized by a news report that sent chills racing down her back. Images flashed on the screen from a crime scene, police cordoning off areas, familiar faces of missing girls filling the frame. The anchor announced a new suspect, David, a man who had recently been released from prison and was rumored to have been seen in the vicinity of the disappearances. Catherine felt her insides clench in terror. No way, she thought. She clenched her fists against her chest, trying to convince herself it was merely a coincidence. Yet, every word from the anchor rang in her ears like an alarm. The footage showed officers interviewing witnesses and collecting evidence. He really could be dangerous, she realized, and that understanding hit her like a lightning bolt. David, with whom she had interacted only a few times, might be connected to the disappearance of other girls. The thought of possibly becoming his next victim was unbearable. She recalled his probing questions, and his smile, and recognized that nothing in this world was random. Catherine got up and began to pace around her apartment, not knowing how to rid herself of this feeling of helplessness. Every sound made her flinch, every step in her apartment echoed like a harbinger of doom. In an attempt to distract herself, She opened a window, but the outside was as unnerving as her thoughts. The shrill sounds of passing cars felt threatening. Her gaze lingered on a dark alley at the end of the street, as if someone with ill intentions might be lurking there. Catherine closed the window and, ignoring the chill, sank into the couch. Pressing herself against a cushion, she knew she had to do something, but what? Call a friend? Inform her family? But what would they say if she wasn't even sure something was wrong? All her thoughts revolved around David, and the more she pondered, the clearer it became that she couldn't just walk away from this. She had to find out what was truly happening and rid herself of this feeling of vulnerability. The next morning, despite her panic and anxiety, Catherine decided she could no longer sit idly by. She dressed quickly, gathering her thoughts as she headed to the local police station. Though her nerves were on edge, an internal conviction grew that she needed to share her encounters with David. Perhaps this could help prevent another disappearance. Upon entering the police station, her heart raced like mad. The bright foyer with its gray walls and the stern faces of officers made her feel like she had stepped into an entirely different world. Catherine approached the desk where a woman in uniform sat. "I want to speak with a detective," she said, trying to sound confident. The woman nodded and called someone on an internal phone. A few minutes later, a detective appeared in the hallway. Tall, with a crew cut and a serious expression, he seemed accustomed to such visits. "You're Catherine?" he asked, extending his hand for a shake. "Yes," she replied, nervously squeezing his hand. They moved to a small interview room. Catherine struggled to gather her thoughts, not wanting to miss anything important. She recounted her encounter with David in detail, describing his questions, how he looked at her, and the news she had seen on television. The detective listened intently, taking notes, but his expression remained neutral. This was somewhat reassuring yet also unsettling. He wasn't quick to conclude, and that sense of uncertainty only heightened her anxiety. "I understand, but keep in mind that many people can seem suspicious without being criminals," he said, setting aside his notebook. "We need more information to assess the seriousness of this." Catherine felt her spirits plummet. Her fears weren't being taken seriously, and that made her feel even more vulnerable. She wanted him to believe her, but she understood the detective couldn't base his investigation solely on her intuition. "But he was watching me, I know it for sure," she exclaimed, her emotions bubbling over. "I can't shake the feeling that he might show up again." Detective Pierce sighed, studying her face closely. "I understand. Try not to panic. If he truly poses a threat, we'll find him," he said, but there wasn't the reassurance Catherine had hoped for in his tone. She felt a wave of sadness wash over her but resolved not to give up. "I can help. I remember what he looked like, and I can tell you everything I know," she asserted, looking him in the eyes with determination. The detective nodded. "All right, I'll take down your information. But keep in mind that we'll proceed cautiously. Stay safe and avoid unnecessary encounters with him. If he appears, let us know immediately." Catherine stood and thanked him. As she exited the station, she felt a sense of having at least done something. But the anxiety still lingered within her. She couldn't shake the feeling that David would still be watching her. She needed to be careful, and now she understood that this was her new reality. Returning to work, Catherine felt as though everything around her had changed. Although she tried to focus on her tasks, thoughts of David wouldn't leave her mind. As if that wasn't enough, she started noticing strange behavior from James, her colleague. James had always been friendly and outgoing, but recently something seemed off. He often glanced her way, but not with the usual curiosity. Rather, it was as if he were looking for her approval or trying to decipher her thoughts. Sometimes he came too close for comfort, making Catherine feel uneasy. She tried to ignore it, but his stares and unexpected questions about her weekends became increasingly intrusive. One day, during lunch, Catherine sat in the communal dining area when she noticed James staring at her from across the room. Her unease grew when he stood up and pulled a chair toward her. "Hey, how's it going?" he asked, flashing a wide smile, but his eyes wouldn't leave her. "Fine, thanks," she replied, striving to keep her tone neutral. Why won't he just go away? She thought, feeling tension rising. "I saw the news about the missing girls," he continued, looking straight into her eyes. "Aren't you worried? It's so close to our area." Catherine felt a lump rise in her throat. Why was he bringing this up now? She responded evasively, trying not to reveal how much it affected her. Well, yes, it's unsettling, but we have to stay safe, she said, attempting to sound confident. James nodded but continued to fixate on her. At that moment, Catherine felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She could have sworn he knew more than he was letting on. That he was watching her. Could he be part of this story too? She wondered. Determined not to stay there any longer, Catherine suddenly declared, "Sorry, I have a lot of work. I need to go," and quickly stood, leaving him with a look of confusion. Once outside, relief flooded her, but the anxiety remained. What's happening? Who can I trust? She pondered, forcing herself to walk faster toward her car. A few days later, as Catherine walked down the street after work, the sensation of danger enveloped her once more. It seemed that not only David was watching her, but someone else too. She turned around, but no one suspicious lingered in the background. Yet, the feeling of alertness clung to her. The following day, as she approached her car again, she felt the prying eyes of someone from a nearby street. With each step, Catherine sensed someone's gaze on her. She tried to convince herself it was just paranoia, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was indeed watching her. One day, at a traffic light, she noticed a man who also waited for the green light. He looked familiar, but at that moment she couldn't place him. Suddenly, he received a message on his phone and glanced at the screen, but Catherine sensed he wasn't merely reading messages, he was looking at her. There was something strange in his eyes, a hint of anxiety as if he were waiting for her to leave. When the light turned green, she quickly turned and headed in the opposite direction, but she felt his gaze linger until she disappeared around the corner. A sense of dread crept into her heart as if he had been watching her all along, enveloping her in fear like a thick fog. Back home, she switched on the television, hoping for distraction. However, the news reports only deepened her anxiety. Each story about missing girls reminded her of her predicament. Catherine realized this wasn't just a coincidence, David likely wasn't alone. That night, as she struggled to sleep, she heard every creak and rustle outside. Her thoughts returned to James. She couldn't shake the feeling that he might also be connected to what was happening. Every action, every glance of his in recent days began to feel like part of a larger plan. I need to find out what's going on, she resolved, finally drifting off only in the early morning, exhausted from worry and anxiety. With that thought, Catherine woke with a determination to conduct her investigation. She knew no one would protect her like she could. Catherine, determined to understand the situation, decided to dedicate some time to research at work. That day, she stayed late after the other employees had gone home. Her heart raced with excitement as she rifled through documents, hoping to uncover a clue. The lingering sense of danger surrounded her, and she was ready for anything. While sifting through old reports in the archive, Catherine stumbled upon a folder that looked suspicious. It was labeled, "Disappearances, Cases from the Past Year." She froze, adrenaline surging through her veins. Opening the folder, she began scanning the documents. Each name and photograph brought her closer to realizing she was onto something significant. Then, among the piles of paperwork, Catherine saw something that made her heart stop. One report contained the name James. It listed his contact information and mentioned sightings near several locations of recent girl disappearances. A chill ran down her spine. This was precisely what she feared. Her heart raced, and panic set in. Why was James in this report? How was he connected to the disappearances? She quickly flipped through the remaining pages, absorbing every word. Some records spoke of suspicious individuals linked to James, and at least one case indicated his presence at a crime scene. Catherine felt overwhelming panic. Could she have been working alongside someone potentially involved in such heinous crimes? Her thoughts swung between shock and fear, and she realized she had to act cautiously. Concealing the documents, she decided she needed to learn more, but it would be difficult to do so alone. She had to talk to Detective Pierce, but she feared James might find out about her intentions. Catherine knew she had to be smarter and more careful than ever before. The next day, Catherine met James during the lunch break. Her heart raced, knowing she had to tread carefully. He was already sitting at the table, lost in thought. She approached, trying to appear casual, despite her inner turmoil. "Hey, James," she began, attempting to keep her voice steady. "Can we talk?" He looked up, and something strange flickered in his eyes. "Sure," he replied, pushing a chair toward her. Catherine sat down, gathering her thoughts. The more she looked at him, the more his calm demeanor heightened her anxiety. "I found some documents in the archive," she started, and his face instantly changed. He leaned in closer as if hanging on her every word. "What documents?" he asked with a slight smirk, but a threat lurked beneath his tone. "About the missing girls," she continued, trying not to reveal her agitation. "I saw your name there." For a moment, tension hung in the air. James smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Really? That's interesting," he said, raising an eyebrow mockingly. "But you should understand that sometimes things aren't as they seem." Catherine felt a shiver run down her spine. "I don't think you're just a coincidence, James," she said, trying to sound assertive. "Girls are going missing, and you seem to know more than any of us." James leaned in even closer, and she felt like he was reading her thoughts. "Do you think you can interfere in this matter?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. It's best to leave things as they are." Catherine felt a surge of rage and fear bubbling within her. She wasn't going to back down easily. "I'm not afraid of you," she declared, though she trembled internally. "I'll go to the police if anything else happens." James smirked, and his smile held no warmth. "You don't understand, Catherine. By getting involved, you put not only yourself at risk but also those you care about. I advise you to stay out of it." His words hung in the air like a thundercloud. Panic rose in Catherine, but she knew she couldn't retreat. "I won't let you intimidate me," she said, clenching her fists. James stood up and took a step back, his expression growing serious. "Just remember, sometimes it's better to stay in the dark. And don't forget, eyes are everywhere," he said before leaving Catherine in a whirl of confusion and fear. She remained seated, feeling her insides churn. Had she become a target in this game? A thought crept into her mind. She had to act quickly while she still had the chance. Otherwise, the consequences could be dire. The days following her encounter with James were filled with anxiety and anticipation. Catherine constantly glanced over her shoulder, as if danger awaited her around every corner. Yet, she resolved not to give in. When her fear became unbearable, she decided it was time to speak with Detective Pierce. Upon arriving at the station, she braced herself for the possibility that the detective might not take her seriously. Still, she hoped the evidence she'd found would convince him. She found him in his office, reviewing reports on the missing girls. "Catherine," he exclaimed, looking up. "Good to see you. What's new?" "Yes, I have information about James," she began, feeling her heart race. "He might be connected to the disappearances." The detective frowned, listening intently. Catherine recounted her findings and explained James's strange behavior during their conversations. She also mentioned her suspicions and the documents linking him to the case. Pierce nodded, his expression turning serious. "You're not the first to mention that name," he said, and Catherine felt her heart race with fear. "We've started looking into him, and it seems he has indeed been spotted near several sites where girls went missing. But there's something that might surprise you." Catherine tensed. "What is it?" "We've received information that David, the man you mentioned, is also not as simple as he seems. He is indeed connected to the case, but he's not the primary perpetrator. There's another person behind this. And we need to find out who it is." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. David was dangerous, but now it was clear there was someone even more sinister lurking behind him. "We're planning to apprehend them," the detective continued, "but we need your help. Be careful and keep your eyes open." She nodded, realizing she was at the center of a dangerous game, and her life could change at any moment. But now she had a goal: to uncover the true criminal. The next morning, Catherine received a message from her mother that sent waves of anxiety through her. Her mom wanted to meet at the cafe they often visited. This message put her on high alert. Recently, she had been avoiding any meetings, but suddenly, she felt that this might be a chance to get clarity on her situation. Arriving at the cafe, she noticed the sun shining outside, yet her internal state was far from calm. As she entered, her heart began to race. She scanned the room but didn't see her mother. Instead, she spotted James sitting in the corner, watching her intently. A chill ran down her spine, and she realized something was off. "Hey, Catherine," a familiar voice suddenly called out. It was David, stepping out of the shadows with a smile. "Where's my mom?" she asked, trying to mask her fear. "She won't be coming," he said with a smirk. "We have more important matters to discuss." In that instant, Catherine realized she had walked into a trap. Her heart sank as she saw James stand up and approach her. "You're too curious," James said, leaning closer. "And that's very bad for you." Catherine attempted to step back, but David grabbed her wrist, leaving no chance for escape. "You don't understand, Catherine," David said, his voice turning menacing. "You've gotten too close to the truth. It's time to end this game." She felt the blood drain from her face, and panic erupted inside her. David and James, two of her greatest fears, were right there, and she had nowhere to turn. "We'll do everything we can to make sure you don't tell anyone what you've learned," James added, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Catherine understood her time was running out. She had to think of something to get out of this situation. Giving up was not an option, even with the odds stacked against her. As darkness threatened to close in, a fire of determination ignited within her. The situation escalated rapidly. Clenching her fists from fear, Catherine realized that staying there would mean signing her death warrant. David's grip tightened, and her heart raced. She knew time was of the essence and was searching for an opportunity to flee. Then, something unexpected happened. James, who had been silently observing, suddenly intervened. "Stop," he shouted, raising his hand abruptly. "This isn't what you think." Catherine turned, bewildered. She didn't know what to expect from James, but his intervention shifted the dynamics of the confrontation. David turned to him in fury. "Are you out of your mind? She knows everything," he growled. "Exactly. That's why she needs help," James replied, his voice firm. "Not here, not now." This moment of confusion gave Catherine a glimmer of hope. "What are you doing?" she asked, unable to believe her ears. "Go," James shouted. "I'll distract him." Without thinking, Catherine sprinted toward the door, knowing she had only seconds before everything reverted to its previous tension. "You won't get away, Catherine," David yelled, but her legs propelled her forward, and she burst outside. As she ran into the street, adrenaline coursed through her veins. At that moment, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Detective Pierce. "We're on our way." "Hold tight." Shaking off her fear, Catherine darted into the nearest alley. Thoughts about James swirled in her mind. Why did he help her? What were his true motives? But right now, those questions don't matter. All she needed was to stay safe. When Detective Pierce and his team arrived, they sprang into action immediately. Catherine, still shaking from the ordeal, recounted everything that had happened. Pierce listened intently, his expression serious. "We'll apprehend David," he said once she finished. "But James is a more complex issue." Catherine felt her heart sink. "He helped me," she replied. "But why? What are his true intentions?" Pierce shook his head. "We don't know. His behavior is strange, and we need to find him. But right now, our priority is capturing David." When the police apprehended David, it felt as if justice was finally being served. Yet, even as they took him away, Catherine couldn't shake the unease that settled in her stomach. Thoughts of James loomed large, adding uncertainty to the unfolding story. Detective Pierce began gathering evidence, and it soon became clear that a criminal network was behind the disappearances of the girls. Assuring Catherine they would work to uncover the full extent of the operation, Pierce felt it was just the beginning. Having survived a harrowing ordeal, Catherine attempted to return to her normal life. But a constant sense of dread lingered. She knew not all players in this dark game had been caught, leaving a deep mark on her psyche. Every creak, and every movement outside her window reminded her that danger still lurked nearby. And while she had managed to escape, fear had become her constant companion. Now, she needed to learn how to live with it, aware that the shadow of crime continued to threaten her existence.